12 terribly active princesses who were not exactly dancing. Written by Michael and Dobbs, illustrated by Bree Paulson. Chapter 1. Once upon a time, in a kingdom much farther away from here than you would think, lived a king and queen and their 12 daughters, Albertina, Belinda, Constantina, Daniela, Edwina, the twins, Francesca and Frederica, Gabriella, Henrietta, Isabella, Josephina, and Regina. But all was not well in the farther away than you would think kingdom. The king and queen had become very worried about their daughters. Every morning the princess's beautiful shoes would be covered in mud and worn to shreds. The bloomers they wore beneath their dresses would have tears in the knees, their hair ribbons would be stained with sweat, and the 12 princesses would be exhausted. They fell asleep at breakfast, and at lessons, and while practicing instruments. It got so bad you could find a sleeping princess just about anywhere in the castle. One evening at a fancy state dinner, Gabriella fell asleep in her soup. The king was furious. That night the king spoke to the princesses. "My dearest daughters," he began, "it's bad enough that every day we have to replace 12 pairs of silk shoes and 12 pairs of bloomers, which isn't cheap. And it's bad enough that you fall asleep during lessons and servants trip over you as you sleep in the halls. But snoring in your soup is the last straw." He looked at the bedroom the princesses shared. It had been the second best ballroom, so it didn't just fit 12 beds. It fit 12 beds, 12 bureaus, 12 armoires, 12 mirrors, 12 bookshelves, 12 soft chairs for reading, 12 straight chairs for posture and sewing, 12 easels, 12 desks for writing, 12 music stands, 4 flutes, 3 mandolins, 2 violins, 1 viola, 1 cello, and 1 hammered dulcimer, plus the princess's clothes, brushes, ribbons, books, quills, embroidery hoops, and musical scores. Like many fathers before him and many after, the king believed healthy young people need sleep, and his daughter's bedroom, or rather the second best ballroom, was too enjoyable. "Tonight," he announced, "you will all sleep in the third best bedroom in the second floor of the west wing." The servants moved the 12 bedsteads and the 12 mattresses and the 11 feather beds and Daniela's hypoallergenic cotton-filled bed and the 12 quilts and the 24 pillows to the third best bedroom on the second floor in the east wing, as they arranged and rearranged until it fit. The princesses kissed their parents good night, but when the princesses ruined their shoes again, the king had them moved to the storage room down the corridor from the scullery. The storage room down the corridor from the scullery had been built to keep rats and imps out, and it would keep the princesses in so they would have no way to ruin their shoes. The servants emptied the storage room down the corridor from the scullery, and after much shoving they fit all 12 bedsteads, 12 mattresses, 11 feather beds, 1 hypoallergenic cotton-filled bed, 12 quilts, and 24 pillows into the storage room. The beds were jammed together, so you had to walk across them to get inside. Chapter 2. The next morning the king rushed to the storage room down the corridor from the scullery. 12 princesses were asleep. Constantina snored a little. Muddy footprints covered the blankets, and in the middle of the beds were 12 ruined pairs of shoes. "That's it!" the king bellowed. "What's it?" asked Josephina, rubbing her eyes. "More sleeping princesses." "But, father, there's still only 12 of us," said Edwina. "More ruined shoes," he shouted, ignoring Edwina. "Perhaps," ventured Albertina, "we could get shoes made out of leather. They might hold up better." But the king called the servants to move the beds. "Daughters," he began, "I have no choice but to move your sleeping quarters again. This time you're moving to the highest room in the southwest corner tower." "Now, dear," interrupted the queen, who had come to see about the yelling, "aren't you being a little harsh?" The servants and the princesses quickly nodded in agreement with the queen. "No," said the king, and everyone knew he meant it. The servants hauled the 12 bedsteads, 12 mattresses, 11 feather beds, 1 hypoallergenic cotton-filled bed, 12 blankets, and 12 pillows up the stairs in the southwest corner tower, all the way to the highest room. It didn't all fit, so they threw the bedsteads out the window, startling the gargoyles. It took the rest of the day to calm them down. The next day the princesses' shoes and bloomers were ruined. There were muddy footprints on their blankets, and Josephine was found sleeping behind the tapestry of the ogre wars. The king decided to issue a proclamation. In this case, the king issued a proclamation by filling out the appropriate form. "Any man who can solve the riddle of the princess's ruined shoes, will receive a princess's hand in marriage, but anyone who tries to solve the riddle and fails will have his head cut off. Now the king was not cruel, nor would he really have married off one of his daughters to someone she didn't love, but forms were quick and easy, and threatening to cut off people's heads meant only serious people would try. For weeks, it meant nobody tried to solve the riddle, and the princess continued sleeping all day and ruining shoes at night. Chapter 3. Far from the castle, a young man wandered alone in the woods. He had been a soldier, but was bad at soldiering. In fact, his whole army was bad at soldiering, which is why he was wandering alone in the woods in a kingdom he didn't know. The young man came to a spring. He was filling his flask when he heard a voice. He turned and saw an old woman. "Would you give an old woman a drink?" she asked. "Certainly," he said, handing her the flask. "Would you give a young man some employment advice?" After suggesting a half-dozen jobs, including goose boy, baker's assistant, griffin herder, and imp catcher, the old woman remembered the king's proclamation. The young man thought about his fear of geese and heights, his allergy to flour, his extreme dislike of imps, and how bad he'd been at soldiering. He also thought about the chance of getting his head cut off, but figured it beat wandering around in the woods. "Where's the castle?" he asked the old woman. She gave him directions and he picked up his pack to go, but then he remembered how helpful the woman had been, and he turned back to speak with her. "Thank you for all of your advice. You've been helpful. And I was wondering how you would solve the riddle of the princess's ruined shoes." The old woman smiled and reached into her bag. "You could ask the princesses what they were doing, but I think this will help you more," she said, and she handed him a cloak folded up small. "This will make you invisible." The young man thanked her again, got her address so he could return the cloak, and headed to the castle. Upon arriving and announcing his intention to solve the riddle, the young man was given the second highest room in the southwest corner tower. That evening he watched the princesses climb the stairs through his room on their way to bed. He said good night to each of them, and as Regina was about to shut the door, he threw on his cloak and snuck in behind her. Inside the room, he saw a strange sight. One by one, Albertina, Belinda, Constantina, Daniela, Edwina, Francesca, Frederica, and Gabriella disappeared into Albertina's pocket mirror. The young man knew that the truth behind the princess's ruined shoes would be on the other side of that mirror. He wasn't sure it was a good idea to go through, but he was sure that getting his head cut off was a bad idea. So he tapped Henrietta on the shoulder, and when she turned, he jumped past her and jumped through. Chapter 4. Now it's worth remembering the young man had been trained as a soldier. His training had included how to use a sword, how to shoot arrows, how to ride a horse, how to keep sharp things sharp, how to avoid being eaten by a dragon, what to do if your commander is enchanted, possessed, or turned into a newt, and how to notice things. Most of his training would have served the young man in good stead if he had been good at soldiering, but he particularly excelled at how to notice things. For instance, while serving in the army, he noticed that they had never properly explained what to do if your commander is turned into a frog. His training in how to notice things meant that the young man, upon passing through the mirror, noticed that he fell right into a pile of bright princess dresses. He also noticed that it was daytime rather than night, and that he was in a nice clearing in some nice woods. He was trying to notice if it was the lack of geese or the lack of imps that made the clearing nice, when Henrietta stepped through Albertina's mirror and on him. Henrietta hurried into the woods, while the young man moved so he wouldn't be crushed again. He watched Isabella, Josephina, and Regina step through the pocket mirror and run into the woods. Then the young man noticed that 8 young men had come into the clearing. They wore strange round hats with flat pieces in front, shirts with words on the back, pants that gathered in below the knees, high socks, and beautiful, delicate, embroidered silk dancing shoes. The young man started noticing other things. Tendrils of long hair slipped out from under the strange hats. The pants looked a lot like bloomers. The young man read the names on the back of their shirts, which seemed familiar: Al, Bill, Stan, Dan, Ed, Frank, Fred, and Gabe. And when Henry, Izzy, Joe, and Reggie came into the clearing and tossed dresses on the pile, the young man figured out that there were not 12 young men standing in the clearing, but rather the 12 princesses dressed as young men. The young man thought about returning to the castle and telling the king what he had learned, but he realized he didn't know how the princesses ruined their shoes. Also, Al had closed the mirror and stuck it in her pocket. The young man followed the princesses through the woods into a park. The park consisted of a large grassy field surrounded by stands of wooden benches on which many strangely dressed people were sitting, like a tournament. The princesses hurried toward the stands and the young man followed, but he lost sight of them in the crowd. The next few minutes of the young man's life were so filled with marvels and wonders it would be impossible to tell everything he saw and what he thought about it. The short version is this: people dressed funny, hot dogs were delicious, and caramel corn stuck in his teeth. Also, his cloak kept him invisible, even in a place where everything was clearly enchanted. But nothing explained the princess's ruined shoes. So the young man went and sat on one of the benches, hoping to see the princesses getting ready to watch the tournament. He couldn't find them in the stands, so he looked at the field. This was nothing like the tournament fields where he was from. Suddenly the crowd cheered, and 9 of the princesses, still in their strange clothes and wearing misshapen brown gloves, ran into the field. Then a man stood holding a wooden club, stood in front of Gabe. The young man jumped up because he thought the man might run at Gabe and hit her. "Oh, calm down, it's just a baseball," said a voice next to him. He turned to see the old woman from the forest sitting next to him. Surprised, he asked, "What are you doing here?" "I like to take in a game now and then. The hot dogs are delicious, and the princesses are pretty good." The young man sat as the old woman explained baseball. She explained pitching and batting and runs and bases and foul balls. And when Joe ran backwards and then leapt into the air to catch a fat fly ball, the young man jumped up and cheered with everyone else. And when Gabe's arm got tired after a few innings and Bill came out of the dugout to replace her, the old woman decided the young man knew enough. She told the young man to get back to the clearing by dark. The young man thanked her again and reminded himself to write her a thank you letter. When the young man got to the clearing, the princesses had put their dresses back on. Frederica and Francesca were jumping up and down. "We won! We won!" they shouted, and the young man saw how happy the princesses were. Chapter 4. Back in his room, the sun was rising. The young man was tired, but it was day, so he started to write a thank you note to the old woman who had been so helpful. He fell asleep and smeared the ink everywhere. He was cleaning up when 2 castle guards came in his room. "The king would like to speak with you," one of them said. The young man yawned and followed him. The king and queen were sitting in the throne room. The king asked, "Have you solved the riddle of the princess's ruined shoes?" The young man thought about the princesses running the bases in their silk dancing shoes. The young man thought about getting his head chopped off. "Yes," he said, "I have solved the riddle of the princess's ruined shoes." The young man thought about the king taking away Albertina's pocket mirror and forbidding the princesses to play baseball. He thought about how happy the princesses were when they played, and he thought about Frederica and Francesca jumping up and down when they won. "Well," said the king. The young man thought very hard. "They are," he said, "under an enchantment that makes them ruin their shoes." The king began to call for the court magicians and the local wizard and the not-so-local witch and the rather distant astrologer. "Wait," said the young man. "I can cure the enchantment, but it can only be done under a full moon." "But the full moon was yesterday," said the king. "Then we will have to just wait a month," said the queen, sensibly. The young man spent the rest of the day trying to figure out what to do, while the princesses sleepily went about their day. He was sitting in the library, and Isabella was dozing on a book entitled Royal Estates, Parks and Grounds and Their Design, when he figured out what to do. "That's it!" he shouted. "What?" asked Isabella. "Go back to sleep. You're going to need your rest," he told her, and he went to see the king. "I've been reading about this enchantment," the young man told him, "and there were many preparations to make." The king told the young man he could have whatever he needed as long as the princesses were freed from their enchantment. The young man returned to the library and made plans, wrote down lists and drew up diagrams. He looked at his lists and plans and diagrams and knew he needed help. The young man talked to the gardeners and the tailors, and the seamstresses and the carpenters and the cobblers, and the hatter and the milliner. And he talked to the music teacher, the history teacher, the elocution teacher, the dance teacher, and the embroidery teacher, and had them cancel classes for a month. And he wrote a thank you note that was not smeared. Chapter 6. Life became strange for the princesses. Their father quit asking about their ruined shoes. Their classes were canceled. They could sleep as much as they wanted. And everyone in the castle was extra nice to them, but busy with something else. And the young man, who they knew was supposed to spy on them, became the busiest person in the castle. So Albertina called a meeting. "I think," said Isabella, "we ought to be glad they're leaving us alone. We should prepare for the baseball tournament." Several of the princesses nodded. "They are planning something," said Belinda. "We should find out what." The twins nodded. "This is the castle. Someone is always planning a ball or a state dinner or an academic conference," pointed out Regina. All of the princesses nodded. Albertina thought about what everyone said. "We must decide if we should spend our time preparing for the tournament or trying to figure out their plans. We should split up. We are sisters in a team, and we need to work together, so we will vote." The princesses wrote their votes on scraps of paper and Henrietta counted them. "It is 7 to 5," she said, "for getting ready for the tournament." This made some princesses very unhappy, but they all agreed to practice more and not go spying on everyone in the castle. It made the young man very happy, since he'd watched the whole meeting from under the invisibility cloak. The princesses, who had been playing good baseball when they were exhausted, were now playing excellent baseball. They had always played together better than other teams, but now they were faster. They began to win more and more games. They made it to the baseball tournament. The tournament was to be played the night before the full moon. The young man knew that this was his chance. All of his preparations could still fail, and his head could still be chopped off. So he followed the princesses through the mirror to the nice clearing. He waited for Al to put the mirror in her pocket, and then he took it. Part of his army training was also how to pick someone's pocket. He knew that was a bad thing to do, but he figured it was better than the king making the princesses stop playing baseball, or, for that matter, getting his head chopped off. The young man burst into the throne room. "Your Majesties," he said to the king and queen, "you must follow me immediately if you want to help the princesses." Of course they did, and the young man had them change their clothes so they could fit in with the crowd at the park and follow him into the mirror. The young man rushed the king and queen past all the magical sights and sounds on their way to the baseball field. The king kept trying to ask questions, but the queen told them to hush, and the young man bought him a hot dog. Chapter 7. The game began, and the princesses ran onto the field. The king jumped up when he saw his daughters. "Oh, calm down, it's just baseball," said a voice next to the king. The king turned to see sitting next to him the old woman who had helped the young man. "Mother!" exclaimed the king. "What are you doing here?" "You're the princess's grandmother?" shouted the young man. The old woman, the Lady Georgina, smiled and winked at the young man. She told her son, the king, that she wouldn't miss her granddaughters playing in the tournament for the world, and could he please pass her a hot dog? The young man and the Lady Georgina spent the game explaining baseball to the king and queen. The princesses spent the game playing as hard as they could. They caught fly balls, hit home runs, stole bases, pitched strikes, and made double plays. It was the best they ever played. And before the ninth inning began, when their silk dancing shoes were in tatters and their feet were bleeding, and they were so exhausted they thought they couldn't go on, Stan looked into the stands and saw her parents there. She waved her sisters out of the dugout. They all looked into the crowd, and there were their mom and their dad and their grandma who'd been watching and cheering for them the whole game. And then it really didn't seem to matter if their shoes were in tatters or not. After the final inning, and after the young man and the princess's parents ran onto the field, and after they all slipped back through the mirror to the castle, and after they found a nice place for the princess's trophy, and after the king commissioned a portrait of his daughters in their uniforms and tattered shoes, and after the young man showed the princesses their new ball field at the castle and their new uniforms and their new well-made leather shoes, and after the big party celebrating the tournament, and after the princesses slept for several days, and after their feet were all healed, the princesses challenged everyone in the castle to a game of baseball. And if the princesses had been excellent before, well, 12 pairs of well-made leather shoes didn't hurt. The king announced that since the young man had solved the riddle of the princess's ruined shoes, he would not get his head chopped off, but he could instead marry a princess if one wanted to marry him. The young man stared at his feet and said, "Actually, I'd rather stay on as the groundskeeper and equipment manager, maybe coach a little league team." Everyone thought this was a wonderful idea. The princesses went back to classes. They practiced baseball in the afternoons and made sure to get plenty of sleep now that their bedroom was back in the second best ballroom. And their grandmother, Georgina, often came to the castle to watch them practice. One day, the Lady Georgina handed Belinda a pocket mirror. "I've always rather enjoyed soccer," she said.